So it is said that there is no time like your first time. And after that, slowly by slowly, the familiarity of repeated experience starts to settle in. As a matter of fact, it is also said, unfortunately, that familiarity breeds contempt. Hopefully not often. But the more and more we experience the same thing over and over and over again, the more that the brightest edges begin to fade, the more that the poignant aspects of those first feelings begin to dull, until it becomes, you know. And so in Easter season, I always think of how fantastic the Easter story is, and yet I'm aware that the more and the more Easter seasons I live through, the more I am susceptible to going, yeah, that's nice. But having what happened in that intervention by God into human history become slowly by slowly dulled, and having the poignancy of the feeling of what God has done slowly by slowly lessen. And so I think, what are the examples of things that are so meaningful in our lives that do not follow that pattern? Where can we see the things where the person moves into a new locale that is glorious and majestic? Maybe it's a wilderness place in which the scenery is awe-inspiring, or maybe it's a big city in which all of the activity and the marvel of human ingenuity just inspire awe. And the person says, I'm never going to take this for granted. And every once in a while, there is that person who 10 years later, 20 years, a lifetime later, wakes up in the morning and looks out upon their surroundings and goes, oh, this is so great. It doesn't happen for most, but it does happen. Or think about the birth of a new child, and the parents look upon that new life and they're overwhelmed with emotion, with responsibility, with oftentimes some fear. They're overwhelmed with all that has come into their life, and they say to themselves, you are so beautiful. And then that child is a teenager and they say different things. Why do we say different things when children become teenagers? They're still beautiful. They're still the same child that we looked upon with such wonder and with such awe when they were new. They are still precious lives gifted by God, and not only to themselves, but also to us, their families. And so in this gospel passage, Jesus encounters his closest friends, and it is an extension of last week. You'll recognize what we heard Jesus say when he comes into their midst, peace be with you. And that is directly because the gospel goes on to say, they were startled and terrified. Yeah. Somebody who's dead is suddenly in your midst. You'd be startled as well. Probably terrified. What is going on? And it says they thought that they were seeing a ghost. Right, that makes sense. Sometimes when we hear this story over and over again, some of the brightnesses of these resurrection appearances begin to fade. Some of the poignancy of Jesus' presence in their midst begins to dull, but we need to recover that. We need to recover the awesomeness that caused the disciples to be startled and terrified and wonder ourselves, what is going on here? And then allow ourselves to pursue that question. Could it really be that God has overcome the natural course of human life and death and broken back into our midst in a way that is perpetually with us? If that is true, that's worthy of a, oh, wow. No matter how many Easter seasons we come through, once again, oh, Wow. That elsewhere in the Gospels, God would so love the world to give God's progeny for the redemption of all humanity. That is worthy of not having its light fade or its poignancy dull. But just saying those words doesn't penetrate. There are some realities that we really have to live with, that have to marinate within our spirits. And Jesus understood that, and so he did this thing in order to really drive home his presence with them. Last week we heard about faithful Thomas, who said, unless I put my hands in his hands and see the mark on his side, I will not believe. This week he says, I'm kind of hungry. You got anything to eat? And he did that not because he needed a meal. That wasn't the point. He did that because, as you will well know from cartoons, ghosts don't eat food. You see the cartoon, they might put something in their mouth and it goes right through them. That's part of the gag. And he ate in their presence, and it was this way of saying, no, really, your eyes do not deceive you. I'm here, I'm with you. To which I can only imagine, wow, about what it's like to be in the midst of that. And so we don't have that same experience of being in the room where it happened, of being the first ones to witness Jesus' post-resurrection appearance. But we have been given the invitation to draw close to God and to experience God's presence in ways that are awe-inspiring, to witness God's light shining upon us, to have our spirits poignantly impacted in ways that create great awe in our lives. And if we were to stop and tell the stories, I would hope that you would have one that has given you that sense of mystery and wonder. God is present. And like the transfiguration that we hear about elsewhere in the world, you want to hold on to that. You want to stay in that time. You want to make it last forever, but it doesn't. And so you're left with the knowledge that reinforces the faith that God is with us, and the looking forward to the next time that you might be awestruck again. We have this story, and it's intended not to be a remote bridge to some ancient experience of other people, but it's intended to be a trigger for our own encounters with God. It is intended to remind us that in this Easter season, we are to strive to reclaim that first time for ourselves. So I will leave you with this. When I was visiting with Don Gregg, when his wife was in the hospital at the end of her life, Don told me that he went into the room the last time that he saw her, and he said to her, "Thank you for marrying me." And she said to him, "Thank you for asking me." I don't remember the number of years that they were married. I suspect that in this church on that day, it was glorious. That all that they hoped for in their life and looked forward to and could not possibly know just seemed limitless in its possibility, and the bliss that they experienced in love with one another was new and fresh. But at the end of life, he still looked upon her like the first time and thought, "This is the woman that I married. Thank you." And she looked upon him at a very different stage in life when things We're not budding with young love anymore. And she thought, I'm so glad I married this guy. And so it happens. It is not inevitable that there's no time like the first time. It is not inevitable that familiarity breeds contempt. It is not inevitable that the more often we hear the Easter stories, the miraculousness of God's presence in our lives and the world will kind of fade into the background. It is possible, and it's real, and it happens in our own time and experience, that we can look upon those whom we love and who love us and say, thank you. And the other can say, thank you. And we can continue to treasure the presence of God in our lives, just as God treasures you and I as beloved in God's sight. Amen.